Hello friend, and welcome back. It's great to see you, and today I'd like to talk about the game Silent Hill 4: The Room. This is a 2004 survival horror game developed by Team Silent, who was the original team that created Silent Hill 1 through 4. So this was the last game where they came together and made it, and was published by Konami. So a very interesting game, the development of it beginning shortly after the release of Silent Hill 2 and 3. The game intended to create a new style and kind of take the series in a brand new direction even. And so the key development aspects included things such as transforming the hub world, this safe world that the character would exist in, into anything but that, and incorporates first-person navigation into the gameplay, including more claustrophobic environments as a result, and increase the emphasis on combat and show, previously explored areas transformed over the course of the game. These are a lot of the development ideologies that were behind Silent Hill 4 and what the team was working on. And so upon release, it was met with some pretty lukewarm reception, but I think over the years it has grown just as much fan appreciation as some of the earlier sequels had as well. So before we dive into the story of the game, the gameplay, and so on, and my thoughts on the game, let's just take a look at the game really quick. So first off, on the bat, I just love the cover art here for the game. Very interesting and intriguing art. And here on the back as well, we see a room full of nightmares. So it says, Henry Townsend finds himself trapped in his apartment, and the only escape is through a mysterious portal that leads to a horrifying alternate reality. With gruesome sights around every corner and his sanity being tested, he must find his way out of this nightmare, enter the room, the latest story in the most terrifying game series of all time. And so I quite like the amount of information you're just getting right off the bat. I mean, this is basically the contents of the game story. At large. And some other cool things they call out, ghosts that defy physical reality. We'll talk a little bit about that. Visual transitions between first and third person. I think that's a big gameplay aspect of this game that was new to the other ones. And otherwise they say explore new environments. That's true. You're going to explore new environments because you're playing a brand new game. But all things considered, let's just open this guy up as well. And again, we have similar art on the cover of the manual, and a little different art style presented on the CD. At least they didn't duplicate it across all three areas. And let's pop this manual open. And I'm also quite happy with the overall preservation of this copy. It's quite impressive. Here we have the manual. It's pretty kind of thin-ish manual, I would say. It's got a nice advertisement for Neo Contra on the back, which is a game I haven't played, but it does look pretty fun, actually. So maybe I'll have to check it out. The inside is, in fact, printed in color, and we get everything from little prologues and backstories on kind of what's going on, who the characters are, some gameplay operation stuff, how to play the game, and what are all these various items. I do like this art presented on the right side of one of the monsters in the game, this monster being particularly terrifying in the times you encounter them in the prison world the most, I would say. And another thing I like is there's also an ad in the back for this Silent Hill Dying Inside. I've heard this comic is not like the best in the world. There's a couple other Silent Hill comics that are a little better than it, but still it did gauge my interest in tracking maybe some Silent Hill comics down and checking them out. Alright, let's put this on the shelf and then we'll talk about the game. Okay, so from a story lens, I kind of covered some of the major beats just reading the back of the game itself. So yeah, the game is set in this town called Ashfield, so it's not in Silent Hill, which is pretty interesting. And it follows a character named Henry Townsend, and he's just kind of a more chill guy. He just kind of laid back and quiet and kind of stays to himself. But unfortunately, he's staying very to himself now because he's been locked in his apartment for almost a week. And he's experiencing recurring nightmares, and he has no means of communicating with the outside world. If you dial a phone number and you call somebody, can't get in touch with anyone. If you bang on the door to, neighbors passing by in the hallway of his apartment, they can't hear you either. And so this becomes quite a situation for Henry. I mean, unfortunately, the only thing the man has in his fridge is one poor little glass of milk. So I think he really needs some help at this point. But after these few days have passed, there's a loud crashing sound that he can hear from his bathroom. And when he investigates it, there's been a hole that's appeared in his bathroom in the wall. And Henry climbs in. And throughout the course of the game, you will venture into this hole in the wall and visit various nightmare worlds where he will meet people who have unfortunately been bound to death. And they are dying in ways quite similar to the deaths from a serial killer, Walter Sullivan, that occurred many years prior. And so throughout the course of the game, you will, of course, find a means to get out of the apartment, hopefully, and you will learn more about Walter Sullivan's past and why these deaths are occurring, and the nightmares themselves are occurring too, and really find yourself in a race to stop Walter to carry out the murder of his intended 21st victim and bring about the cultist, the completion of the cultist ritual, which is something that occurs in the game as well as far as the story beats go. And I gotta say that I thought the story was very well written. It does require a little bit of research to really envelop yourself in the A to B plot line of the game. However, I did really enjoy learning about the characters, experiencing the world, and the progression of the story across the game, not just being something that's kind of actively happening, but is transforming the world in which you live in. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the gameplay area as well. I do got to say, from like a game-focused perspective, the game is very narrowed in on creating a gameplay experience. And so oftentimes what I felt was that traversing the world really takes precedent over experiencing the story. And so while Walter Sullivan is a genuinely terrifying villain, a very well-written villain within a well-written story, I think a lot of it does get put on the back burner for most of the game because a lot of its deliverance is through notes, and it's pretty convoluted. And especially the first half of the game, you're just going to be wandering around thinking to yourself, like, what the hell is even going on? I don't even know what's happening. So at least that was my experience. So, and this is compared to the other Silent Hill games where I felt like through cutscenes and through the exploration of the world, you kind of get a more structured layout of kind of what's going on and what the story is and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, that was my thoughts. I enjoyed the story, just wish it was delivered a little better. And another fun thing about Silent Hill games is always the endings. There's tons of endings, at least for a handful of the games. And there are many endings here as well. And the endings are various. They're interesting and very designed based on how you're playing the game, similar to Silent Hill 2 in these respects in a lot of ways. So I did quite enjoy that. Overall, the story was very solid and fun. I'm glad I got to play this game and enjoy the story. All right, let's talk about, from a gameplay perspective, how this game kind of functions in its form. So the ultimate goal is to escape your apartment. It comes down to that basically. But throughout this process, you'll navigate the apartment, which is your hub world, in a first-person view. And you'll use this space as an area to save, to heal. There's some minor puzzle solving you'll do here. You can store objects here. And so this will basically be your hub to heal up, get ready, and prepared to go back into the nightmare world. And so the hub world itself does kind of undergo a transformation throughout the game, and ultimately becomes a place just as haunted as the nightmare world, and will present obstacles that will hurt you. And it does so very effectively, because in order to cure these hauntings, you have to have candles. And the candles are pretty limited throughout the game and have a couple other uses, including healing a companion that'll join you later on. And so I found it very interesting the way in which they interwove what's going on with Henry in this nightmare world, and creating within the player this expectation, or destroying the expectation, that you can go to this safe place and be okay. I thought that was very cool, and I loved the, yes, claustrophobic feel of the first-person exploration within the apartment, and it added something really cool to the gameplay that had not been done in the first 3 games. And I did love that Team Silent was continuing to find ways to innovate successfully in the formula they had already quite well accomplished. So that was very cool. The main levels, when you're in the Nightmare worlds, they're navigated in third person, kind of similar to the other Silent Hill games. The camera is slightly more pulled back, I felt like, compared to the other games as well. And Henry is very fluid in his movement. He can really turn on a dime and spin around, and it's not kind of tank control driven, which the older games had both 2D and 3D directional mappings for character movement. But I just felt like this was much more reactive and easier to control, so I really like that. The combat style does remain the same. It's mostly just a lock onto your enemy, start swinging away or shooting until they go down, and then once they're down lying on the floor, of course, you always want to give them a couple stomps just to make sure that they're for sure out. So the combat, while was a focus of the game, I think just the responsiveness and the animations and the fluidity of the controls really helped just make it feel better, but it still continues to be its typical clunky, classic Silent Hill kind of vibes. So your mileage will vary on whether you are okay with that or not. Some other little gameplay things. So the player has a limited inventory, can maybe carry like 8 or 10 items, and inventory management will become super important later in the game as you have to have space for key items and so on and so forth. So you'll spend a lot of time kind of going to the hub world and managing objects and storing them away. So that is an aspect of the game. Puzzle solving, which is huge in Silent Hill games, has been kind of limited slightly a bit here compared to those older titles, as the team really wanted to focus on creating a more combat-driven experience. And again, I think they did so pretty successfully. The puzzles in Silent Hill games are hit or miss. It really depends. And in the latter half, Henry's also put on this escort quest where you'll take a character through the last few hours of the game while being chased by an evil being. And while some aspects of this from a gameplay lens are very interesting, other aspects are not, because of course you have to keep this person safe, and the person's well-being will kind of generate the outcome of the ending of the game. And so, again, it's hit or miss. So I was kind of lukewarm on the gameplay experience overall. I liked some of the changes to like the mechanical nature and the technical nature of playing the game. It felt more fluid, it felt more well designed, but some of the new gameplay innovation stuff, the escort quests, the puzzles, which I'll talk about briefly, were not so well put together. And so, it really depends on your feelings. I really prefer, even if it's clunkier, that old school Silent Hill 2 vibe, or Silent Hill 1 even. I felt like those games still, while having an expectation of how they're going to play, were continually fun and engaging. So some of the more personal comments I wanted to make. So the monsters in the game, very cool. I love the design, especially the undying ghosts. So there's ghosts in this game, and they actually can't be killed. You can use some special items to pin them to the earth and keep them from moving. But other than that, these scenarios really change up some of the tactical thought process of visiting or revisiting areas, which I really enjoyed that a lot, because it made for an experience where you can't just go through an area and just whack enemies and then kind of move on. You have to really think a bit better about how you don't get hurt, how you take a companion through that area without also being hurt. And so I really enjoyed that. I will say that when fighting enemies, sometimes occasionally there were just too many enemies that you had to deal with at once. A big issue here is that when you aim, you kind of auto lock onto a specific enemy, and the auto lock will always prioritize active threats, as opposed to if you knock an enemy to the ground and you lose your auto lock, you get hit and kind of stun locked a bit, and you have to re-aim at an enemy. The ones lying on the ground are not the prioritization. So if you are dealing with a situation where you're trying to take on a whole group of monsters and you are knocking them to the ground, well, they will begin to get back up, and then now you have to continue this fight. And so I did find, from like a mechanical sense, this was a bit frustrating to deal with. I mentioned earlier obtuse puzzles. There is one in particular that brings up a great example where you have to get a key, and the key is within a fridge in the nightmare world. And so what you have to do is, if I remember right, you have to go back to the hub world. You get these notes underneath your door, and once you get a specific note, then this key will spawn. And the key might be in a fridge that you've already, in a room that you've already visited. And on top of that, like 99% of the fridges in the game are either not interactable or don't open. And so from the moment you get this note, you have to then assume, oh, there's a key in this fridge, and I have to go back to this fridge and interact with it to get the key. And this key is the only way to kind of move forward. And there were a few occasions where there were puzzles like this in the game that just kind of grinded my gears. The puzzles were more obtuse. They were less, but more obtuse, and created more firewalls for me to kind of have to figure out. For this one specifically, I had explored and re-explored the entire nightmare world that this had happened in. And I honestly just had to refer to a guide on, like, okay, what do I do? Because I have no freaking clue. And it's unfortunate because I'm not like a guide user. You know, I prefer to play my games as ignorant as I can, even not even looking at a trailer for most games. It was just one of those occasions where I had to use one to figure out what was the next step. And unfortunately, the game shouldn't put players in those situations. And so that was one thing that I did want to comment on. I mentioned the escort quests. Towards the end of the game. These sections are pretty frustrating, you know, whether it's dealing with ghosts or big groups of enemies, or just running ahead just a little too fast. And this will damage your I guess, well-being of your companion. And again, it'll cause very adverse outcomes for the ending, which made it mean that if you wanted a specific ending, you had to treat this section very slowly, with a lot of love and care and protection. And unfortunately, there are areas, especially in, like, there's an apartment world where you have to leave the companion, but you just never know if they are in danger or not. And unfortunately, in one of my playthroughs, I left them in like an elevator area, and when I came back, they were completely bloody and bruised because, of course, I wasn't around, but I was trying to accomplish running through some areas without having to necessarily worry about their well-being. Maybe that's on me, but I found the escort questing unfortunately not particularly fun, and it does hamper my enjoyment to go back and play this game again someday in the future. So, last comment, I love the transformation of the hub world. This is just so cool that it goes from like this very safe place where you know you'll be healed, you'll know you'll be ready for the next fight, to really a dangerous place where nowhere feels safe now. You can't, in the nightmare world, you don't feel safe. You go to the hub world and there's ghosts popping out of your freaking walls attacking you. And I enjoyed this. I enjoyed this quite a bit. So from a gameplay lens, some frustrating aspects, but overall I loved just what they were doing differently. The horror, the design of the world was just so impressive. Not to tackle that the UI was super minimal. I love this as an aspect in a lot of games because then you can truly immerse yourself quite a bit in the world. But adversely, you know, one of the things that takes away from that immersion is that this game feels the most game-like of the first 4 Silent Hill games. So maybe because of that, you don't get as deeply in there as maybe Silent Hill 2 or 3 or 1, in my opinion. So yeah, I love the world design. I thought that the nightmare worlds were engaging. They were a little confusing at times to explore or kind of understand the specific objectives, but for the most part, a lot of those objectives are pretty straightforward. You know, find an item, go to this place, albeit some obtuse puzzles. Overall, I had a lot of fun just playing the game, even with some of its frustrations, which I think many players share anyway. Okay, last couple things to comment on from a sound lens. Akira Yamaoka, he's a god. He returns and does the soundtrack for this game, and the soundtrack is great. I mean, it's just as good as the other Silent Hill games. And while I'm not as familiar with some of the songs, I did spend time kind of revisiting and enjoying the sounds that Yamaoka brings here. And in some situations, the sound design is what makes this game scariest, which I think was also presently true for the other preceding Silent Hill games. The sound effects, though, are a bit hit or miss. The enemy design is fantastic, but oftentimes the sounds they make just don't work, I don't think, with the enemies. So like, there's a dog you'll encounter throughout the game, dog enemy, and it'll attack you, but it sounds like a screaming cat, like a screeching hyena. It just didn't make any sense to me. Or later you'll be in like a hospital world, and there's like these mutated like nurse monsters maybe, and when you hit them, they like burp, and it just really, those sounds just didn't really work for me from a horror perspective. They didn't increase how like, oh snap, this monster's crazy, it makes a crazy sound. It just kind of sounded out of place and took me out of the immersion of the game. So, but one thing that was really nice is that the voice acting is, I think, pretty great, professional, matured, straightforward, and you know, this is one of the things that people often comment on for the first couple Silent Hill games, and it is a product of its era, and also true in my perspective that Team Silent was going for something very specific in those games as well, like Silent Hill 2, making it very kind of Lynchian, David Lynchian in its presentation and in its voice acting. But yeah, I really did enjoy kind of overall the sound design. The music's great, sound effects are kind of weird, the voice acting is quite effective. And then from a graphics perspective, the game has aged quite well in my opinion, held up by very strong art direction and design overall. Art direction being seriously impressive, constantly one-upping the earlier entries in terms of the grotesqueness, the goriness, the transformation of the world you'll be in. You know, towards the end of the game, literally all of the surfaces are just feel like they're crawling and are gory, and just, I loved the intensity and kind of just what they've done visually to keep me on my toes, keep me anxious, and through just what I'm seeing, feeling that way. And this is coupled with a fantastic enemy design, some of the enemies here being the most visually interesting and spooky, I think, of the original series entries. And just the world environments are just, again, becoming increasingly insane and really upping the ante throughout. So I really did love the way the game looked. I loved the way the game sounded. I loved how it played. The story was very intriguing, and while across all these things I did have some nitpicks here or there and a big hesitation on replaying it just because of dealing with the latter few hours where you're doing this companion escort quest, I would say that I had a lot of fun playing Silent Hill 4 and enjoying the title. So if you haven't played it, maybe you're like me, I've played Silent Hill 2 more times than I can count on my hands, and because of that, while the game is a spooky horror game, it really does feel safe. It really does feel, I know all the hallways, I know all of the puzzles, I know where to get the objects and how to stay safe from fighting any enemy. Silent Hill 4 was a visit back to this feeling of, I don't know this world super well, I don't know where I am, and this is a very dangerous place. It felt really nice to feel that way playing a Silent Hill game again. So I'm really happy that I was able to play and experience this game. I'd be interested in knowing if you've played Silent Hill 4, what your perspective of the game was, and also appreciate you tuning in to kind of hear my thoughts on the game as well. Hope you liked the video, and if you liked it, please do like the video and subscribe. Would love to have you around for the next review or whatever content I make here on the channel. So anyways, thanks for tuning in. Hope you stay well, and take care of yourself. Look forward to seeing you next weekend. All right, see ya. Bye.